Our day begins with Dr. Amy Margolis, Neuroscience of Anxiety and Reading. Dr. Margolis is an assistant professor of medical psychology at Columbia University Irving Medical Center and the director of the Environment, Brain, and Behavior Lab. She has a doctorate in applied educational psychology, school psychology from Teachers College, and is trained as a clinical neuropsychologist with 2 decades of experience assessing and treating children with learning and attention disorders. Dr. Margolis is an expert in human neuroimaging and focuses her learning disability research program on the brain basis of psychological factors that affect children with learning disorders, such as anxiety and executive functions problems. Recent publications from her lab include papers using functional MRI to study the neural correlates of executive functions in reading disorders, in anxiety and reading disorder, and in the effects of prenatal exposure to commonly used flame retardants on the efficiency of the brain's reading network. It's really interesting. Very neat. So anyway, I bring you up Dr. Margolis. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Joan, for that really nice introduction. I'm gonna put this here. How's my volume? Good. So I'll echo Joan's thanks to Will Baker and the Dyslexia Foundation. What a fantastic organization. And today's agenda is just so important. It's on a topic of great interest to me over the course of my career, and I'm thrilled to be here and be part of this day and be able to help out and pitch in, and hopefully together we'll create something amazing for these kids. I think this is such an important topic, and really we're on the leading edge of where we need to be making change for kids with these issues. There's no echo, this is all okay? Great, okay. So I'll jump right in. I'm going to speak today about the neuroscience of anxiety and reading. In this first slide, I'm going to review our learning objectives. So first, I'm hoping that I will let you develop a basic understanding of the brain and how we use magnetic resonance imaging, otherwise known as MRI, to study the brain. Second, I'm hoping that you'll acquire basic knowledge of brain circuits involved in anxiety disorders and reading disorders. And third, I'm going to describe the brain basis of anxiety in children with reading disorder and present findings from a recent publication out of my group. So that's our agenda. So in order to understand MRI, I think we need to start with some basic neuroanatomy. The brain has many parts that all work together and also have distinct roles. Here is a cartoon showing you the inside of the brain. So this, many times today, I'm going to talk to you about what you're viewing and how you're viewing it. This is a side view of the brain, but through the middle. So if you slice my head through the middle, this is called a mesial view. It's also called a sagittal view. And what you're seeing is, imagine an orange. If you cut an orange down the middle where the seeds would be, this is what you're looking at. And so this top layer here is the cortex, which you may have heard of, and it's really important for us in order to perform complex cognitive functions. And the cortex has some lobes. We have the frontal lobe, a parietal lobe, a temporal lobe, an occipital lobe. And then highlighted in these nice colors are structures that are involved in the limbic system, which are really important for experiencing emotion. And since we're talking about anxiety today, we'll be talking about some of these structures. And I'm just going to go through them for you. Here's the hippocampus. How many people have heard of the hippocampus? Fantastic, because you're all teachers, right? You want kids to learn and remember things. The hippocampus is really important for that. Here's the thalamus. Anyone familiar with the thalamus? Less so, right? It's actually an incredibly important structure that gates all sensory information up to the cortex and is part of these corticostriatothalamo-cortical loops that are just a big name for these complex loops that go through the brain and are very important for different aspects of cognition. We're not going to talk about that one today. But here's the amygdala, and we will spend a lot of time talking about the amygdala. Has anyone heard of the amygdala? Okay, great. And then this is, in orange, the corpus callosum is the largest bundle of white matter tract that connects the left and right hemisphere, and the cingulate, which has an anterior portion, a mid portion, and a posterior portion. So I forgot, I guess because this is a cartoon of a person, you can see the nose. This is the front of the brain, and this is the back of the brain. And I'll try to remember to orient you to all these brain pictures today with the front of the brain, the back of the brain, and what kind of slice you're looking at. So we've learned about the brain in many ways over time. We use tools like postmortem dissection to understand what's happening in the brain, and we can use tools like staining to understand what types of cells are parts of different structures in the brain, and we use non-human animal studies to look at how certain structures in the brain subserve behaviors. Another important way that we've learned a lot about the human brain is through human lesion studies, which are examples and instances when people have some sort of injury or illness that gives rise to neurological damage and then have some change in behavior. And that's been incredibly important also for our understanding of the brain. But today I'm going to talk about MRI. So I also just want to mention there are other structures on here that we are not going to talk about today, but that are really important for cognition, specifically and importantly the cerebellum down here, okay? But it's not really going to come up too much. I just want to mention that one. So we have all these old tools, and we have a new tool called MRI. Magnetic resonance imaging uses a strong magnetic field to take pictures of the brain. This is a cartoon and a photograph of MRI and the setup. So many of you may have had an MRI, say for your head if you got a concussion, or for your knee if you had a knee problem or shoulder problem. MRI takes pictures with a magnet, and so here's the individual lying in the magnet space. Here are the magnets and the gradient coils. And if you're having an MRI of your brain, we put a head coil on you, so it feels like you're wearing a helmet. And then you're slid into the machine like this guy here, and you're told to stay perfectly still. Like, don't move at all, right? And so when you're scanning 7-year-olds, that's a big challenge. In fact, people have dedicated lots of their career to figuring out how we're going to get kids to lie still in the scanner, because when you're doing research, you can't medicate children to get them to stay still. You know, if there's a child who needs an MRI for medical reasons, they might sedate the child, but for research purposes, we would never do that. So this is the basic setup. And what does MRI show us? It allows us to take pictures that show us, for example, the size and shape of the brain and its structure. So this is a little cartoon. Structure is useful when we're looking for something like a mass in the brain, or, you know, someone had a stroke. Where was the stroke? How extensive is the damage? It also can allow us in healthy individuals in research to look at the shape or the structure or the size of a brain region. We also can look at activation of structures. So many of you may have heard of functional MRI or fMRI, and you read studies that are really good studies. They end up in the newspaper where there's some new finding, right? And typically what happens is individuals go in the scanner and they're asked to perform some task, and we can then make an inference about what part of the brain is subserving the capacity to perform that task based on what part of the brain is lighting up during the scan. So the little dots here are meant to show that these regions might be active during a particular task. And last, we can use MRI to understand the connectivity between structures. So we can understand connectivity really at least in two ways. One is structural connectivity, where we look at the white matter tracts that connect distal regions. Distal regions are regions that are far apart from one another. So you may have a region here and a region here, and they're connected by a white matter tract, and we can understand the integrity of the tract. And that allows us to look at how well connected two areas are, sort of like a highway. Does it have a lot of traffic on it? We're in LA, or is the highway moving well? And then we also can use functional imaging, like fMRI, to study connectivity. So I spoke a moment ago about putting someone in the scanner and having them perform a task, and we can look at what part of the brain is lighting up while they're doing this task. We also put people in the scanner now and ask them to just let their minds wander freely. It's called resting state fMRI. So the instruction is keep your eyes open and just let your mind wander freely. And what we're looking for are patterns across the brain of regions that are activating together. And from that, we make an inference about connectivity between those regions. So I'm going to talk a lot about resting state fMRI today and show you results from studies, also from studies of structural and task-based fMRI studies. But I just want to set the groundwork, and I'll come back and explain those methods once again when I am presenting some data. All of this helps us understand how the brain performs the complex functions that we all do, that you're doing right now: sitting, listening, staying aware, tuning out your phone, right? Concentrating, maybe taking notes. And we've come to have a circuit-based view of the brain. So in modern understanding of neuroscience, we really think about circuits that underlie different behaviors, cognitive processes, and functional outcomes. And this is a figure from a recent paper that shows functional networks that we have seen over time. Many times these results have been replicated. And I wanted to show this just to really underscore for you how important these circuits are in the brain. So again, this work comes from resting state fMRI. Individuals were told to lie in the scanner, let their mind wander freely. And what researchers were able to show are which regions were activating together over time, and from that to infer circuits. All of these references are also in my slides, I think, at the back. So the color-coded names of the networks match the colors that you see on these brains. So first I'm going to orient you to these brains. This is the lateral view of the brain. This is the front of the brain and the back of the brain. Here's the frontal lobe, here's the temporal lobe, occipital lobe, parietal lobe. And for example, we might look at the default mode network. That's a really important network. It's one of the first one of the first networks ever identified with this resting state method. And any area that's colored in red is considered part of the resting state, part of the default mode network. So this is the left side of the brain, this is the right side of the brain, and again, this is the mesial view. So if we slice the head down the middle, here we're looking at the front of the brain, the back of the brain, and here the front of the brain and the back of the brain. So you see anything that's colored in red, this is the medial prefrontal cortex, and this is the posterior cingulate. These are really the two hubs of this default mode network, which is well understood to support things like daydreaming, mind wandering, and that's why it was one of the first networks to be identified in resting state, because the instructions are let your mind wander. And we have come to understand that this circuit is disrupted in a number of neurodevelopmental disorders, particularly in autism spectrum disorder. There's considerable research showing that the development of the default mode network is not on par with typical neurodevelopment, in some ways explaining some of the difficulties children with autism spectrum disorder have, where it's difficult for them to not be so internally focused, right? And the default mode network is all about your internal state and autobiographical thinking, mind wandering. Okay, so this is just a picture to show you. We have like a visual circuit, we have an auditory circuit, we have something called the frontoparietal circuit, which is very important, and the cingulo-opercular are the two circuits that underlie executive functioning. We're not talking about those today, but they're very important. And I think this is enough about these circuits. I just really want you to see that they've mapped, these circuits cover the entire surface of the cortex and contribute to all of these important networks. And this has been shown in multiple samples and is really a very robust finding that people are comfortable with. So although lesion studies give us insight into structure and function, structure-function relationships, we also understand that the brain works in these circuits, and that's really important that we all start to change our way of thinking. We don't have a specific brain region that allows us to do only one thing. We really have multiple regions that contribute to circuits that allow for behavior. So that concludes part one. Right? We've done a little lecture on neuroanatomy and the tools we use to understand the brain. And I'm going to shift now and try to tell you about the circuits that underlie anxiety disorders and reading disorders in children. So I want you just to take a moment and think about students you have in your classrooms, students who you have thought, wow, maybe this person's anxious. I wonder why this student is acting this way. Maybe they're nervous. Maybe they're really uncomfortable. So really take a minute, try and think about a kid who you worry about their worry. And I'm going to go through and just give you a little bit of a vocabulary of the diagnostic categories that are in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM-5, for anxiety disorders. And then later today you'll hear more about different anxiety disorders, but I'm going to just show you some of the anxiety disorders that appear in the DSM-5. First, we have generalized anxiety disorder. This is really characterized by general worry. Will my mom come get me? Am I going to be late? Am I going to fail that test? These aren't worries that are focused on one particular topic, but tend to be more generalized. And you might think of this kid as just a kind of garden variety worrier, right? A student in your class just always has things on their mind that they're concerned about. Another kind of anxiety is separation anxiety disorder, and I love this cartoon because it really tells us a lot about child development and separation anxiety disorder. So here's the teacher bending down, trying to make eye contact, seemingly really friendly, approaching the child just like you would want, and the kid is just clinging to mama's leg, right? And then back here, you have this child who's just skipping into class on their own. And this cartoon really shows you how there's such a wide variety among children with how they handle coming into a class, leaving their familiar adult, entering a strange situation, and the different kinds of things that can happen for children. And when this separation is, if this is the first day of school and this child's clinging to their mother's leg, that might not be so unusual. If it's still January and this child's having trouble saying goodbye to mom in the morning, we're going to be more concerned. Another kind of anxiety is social anxiety disorder, which really can affect children in school quite a bit. I love this cartoon because it's showing the kid holding their head, cheeks are red, and the steam is coming off the top of the head, which really lets you feel what people often feel when they're anxious, right? A flood of anxiety. They'll talk about, I started to sweat. My whole face turned red. It was really terrible. I was so nervous. And social anxiety disorder is often characterized by real concern about speaking in front of people, because they're afraid that they'll be judged as saying something dumb or not looking like they know what they're talking about, or having difficulty entering a social situation. It's so hard to engage with other people. What will they think of me? Maybe I'm going to say the wrong thing. They won't think I'm funny. They won't think I'm nice. They won't like me. And it's really accompanied also by these physiological symptoms. Another kind of anxiety is specific phobia. This cartoon is showing a little one up on a chair because there's the dreaded spider, eek. And there are all kinds of phobias that people have. And this is also, of course, accompanied by a physiologic response. People can have phobias to lots of different things. There are very common kinds of phobias: airplanes, spiders, snakes, and then other kinds of phobias as well. And last, panic disorder, which is characterized by the rapid onset of symptoms and the feeling of stress. It's very physiological. People have shortness of breath, pain in their chest. They think they're going to die. It causes many visits to the emergency room because people are sure they're having a heart attack, and really they're having a panic attack. And this is, of course, the real integration of cognitive and physiologic symptoms. So where does all of this anxiety come from? Well, we are humans, and we are blessed with having language and complex thought. Anxiety is the product of our brain's ability to understand emotion states, but our brain is not wired for anxiety. Our brain is wired for threat. We then understand that a threat is something we could be worried about, and the concept of worry is an emotion, or the concept of anxiety is an emotion that is a human phenomenon that we've come to label. But threat is a much more basic process in the environment that many animals experience, and the brain processes. So we identify threat with the amygdala. If I show you this picture, you might recognize that this could be a threatening stimulus. And the amygdala is our threat detection center. So again, here's a cartoon of the brain with the cortex on top. This is the front of the brain, the back of the brain. This is the mesial view. Remember, like you're slicing through the middle of the head or the orange. And this little green region here is the amygdala. It's very important in something called a salience network that's allowing us to identify what is important and to detect threat. And some of the seminal work understanding the role of the amygdala was, in fact, from lesion studies. There was a famous case of a patient, SM, who had amygdala problems and had very little ability to detect threat. And so we've come to understand that when the amygdala is altered in some way, possibly this leads to difficulty interpreting threat and thus leading to the experience of anxiety. So I'm going to show you some well-known, robust studies about anxiety and brain structure first. We've come to understand, this is a paper from 2014 with a nice sample size and replicating results and really robustly showing that in children with anxiety disorder, there is an enlargement of the amygdala. So now instead of a cartoon, this is an actual sagittal view of the brain. This is the front of the brain. This is the back of the brain. Here's our friend, the cerebellum, and here's the amygdala. And then these researchers also published coronal views of the brain. So this is looking at the brain from the back of the head. So instead of slicing through the middle, now we're looking, right, as if you could x-ray through the back of someone's head. And here's the amygdala. What these researchers found, if you look at this graph on the x-axis, are anxiety scores, and higher scores meant more anxiety. And on the y-axis is the relative amygdala volume, so the size of the amygdala. And what they saw was that as children had higher levels of anxiety, they had larger amygdala volumes. And in this last graph, they show this again. This is a bar graph showing the left amygdala and the right amygdala. And what I want you to appreciate here is just that the dark bars represent individuals with high levels of anxiety, and the gray bars individuals with low levels of anxiety. And you can see that the individuals with high levels of anxiety have larger amygdala volume. This is amygdala volume again on the y-axis. And those without anxiety or with less anxiety had smaller amygdala volume. And this pattern was true on the left and the right side of the brain. We're really moving away from this idea of right brain, left brain. We understand that each hemisphere is specialized for certain functions, but the brain is working in concert in circuits bilaterally across both sides of the brain. And we do have lateralized functions where one side of the brain may take over for particular capacities, but the other side of the brain is certainly working during those capacities as well. So it's just a more modern way of thinking about the brain. So we do know that individuals with more anxiety, particularly children with more anxiety, have bigger amygdalas. What do we know from task fMRI? Remember, this is where I told you we put someone in the scanner and we have them do something and we look at what part of their brain is active or lights up. So this is the setup. I just want to show it to you, see how it works. We put someone, they lay down. We put earphones on them because it's quite noisy, if you've ever had an MRI. We don't want them to move at all. So in order to understand what they think in response to some of the stimulus that we're showing them, we often give them a button box so they can press a button. That's the most motion we want them to make. We don't want them to move their head at all. So we're really not going to ask a child to read out loud in the scanner if we want to study their reading. Okay, so here's a computer. It projects, the computer sends information to a projector. The projector is then viewed through a mirror, and the person in the scanner can look at stimuli. And in some really early important papers, Danny Pine's work and others, what they did was have children look at neutral and fearful faces. Children with anxiety disorders had overactivation of the amygdala. Here's the amygdala in that coronal view again, looking from the back of the head, and here's the amygdala. These children with anxiety disorders had overactivation or greater activation of the amygdala in response to fearful versus neutral faces. And here you can see these are the healthy children. This is 0. So what's important here is that the healthy children didn't have greater activation in response to fearful faces versus neutral stimuli, whereas the children with anxiety did. And this was a negative control sample of children with depression who also did not show this same pattern. So far I've told you that in children with anxiety disorders, they have enlarged amygdala volume, and now I've told you that they have overactivation of this amygdala in response to fearful stimuli. And this is from 2001, but this result has been replicated many times in lots of different ways. So we know, though, that anxiety disorders are more complex than just identifying threat, right? We aren't just animals in the jungle worrying about threat, seeing a predator, responding. We actually don't just feel threat and get frozen. Different things happen in response to different contexts. And so we have all these different kinds of anxiety disorders that I spoke about. And one common theme is how we cognitively process the recognition of threat and how we regulate our response to threat. So I'm going to talk more about that. How does threat manifest into anxiety? Well, we have this threat, the amygdala detects it, here's our stimulus, he's coming at us, we're feeling a little nervous. But then we can appraise this stimuli and we can monitor our response to this stimuli using our prefrontal cortices. So as teachers, you probably hear a lot about executive functions. You probably hear a lot about the prefrontal cortices, giving everyone the ability to do these executive functions. And in a way, this is an executive capacity. What we're doing here is saying, is this stimulus something I really need to worry about? And I want you all to look at this lion and imagine it's coming at you. And now, do you see the difference? Because when he's behind a cage and you're at the zoo, you really don't need to worry about this guy coming at you, right? Your prefrontal cortex can say, hey, amygdala, it's time to turn down a little bit the volume. That is not such a threatening stimulus. I don't need to be so worried about that. And in fact, that's what our brains do. And this ties with our understanding of the brain as a circuit-based system. And this particular circuit is called the emotion regulation circuit. And I'm going to talk about this emotion regulation circuit quite a bit today. So we have the amygdala, which is a threat detection center, and we have the prefrontal cortex, which allows us to monitor or appraise stimuli. How do we study this kind of circuitry? This is back to resting state fMRI. I told you that we can have people lie in the scanner and look at these circuits. I showed you that cartoon or figure from a paper of all the different circuits that people have replicated time and again, that we have all these different circuits. We also have this emotion regulation circuit. And the way we study this with resting state is this is data from my lab. These are brains from a sample of about 200 kids that we have put together at Columbia. And here is the amygdala in red. Here's the prefrontal cortex, the part that this whole thing is prefrontal, but this is medial prefrontal cortex that we're particularly interested in. And what we do is extract the value of activation in this area. We call this a seed. So here is our amygdala seed, here's our prefrontal cortex seed. And on the x-axis, I'm going to show you time. On the y-axis, I'm going to show you activity. And this red line shows you the time course of activation in the amygdala of one child over time, right? So you can see that it starts around 0, it's going up and down, here it's down, here it's up, here it's down, here it's up. And then I'm going to look at the time course of brain activation in the prefrontal cortex. And what we're trying to understand is how tightly coupled these two signatures are. Now, at first glance, this looks like, whoa, they're not really very similar, right? Correlations are tricky. With a correlation, what we're trying to do is understand how much two things travel together. So in a positive correlation, we might say, if it's raining, I'm likely to take an umbrella. Or if I grow 2 inches, I'm likely to gain 5 or 8 pounds, right? So these things are likely to happen together. There are also anti-correlations, which are also strong relationships. If it's snowing out, I am unlikely to wear my bathing suit on the street, right? So that's an anti-correlation, and that's what we're seeing here. So you can notice here the amygdala is high and the prefrontal cortex is low. Here the prefrontal cortex is high and the amygdala is low. And this is occurring across all of this time. And all I'm showing you here is a replication of what others have shown in their research, which is that the connectivity from the amygdala to the medial prefrontal cortex is typically negative. so that you can do the thing I just showed you with our friend the lion. When you see the lion coming at you, you're like, whoa, threat. Oh, but there's a cage. I don't have to be threatened. So as one turns on, the other turns off, right? And so there's also a developmental story here. We all know that little children between, say, well, in this study, they looked at children 4 to 9, and for sure children before the age of 4, have difficulty with this kind of emotion regulation. So at the top is, again, a sagittal view. This is the front of the brain, the back of the brain. Here's the cerebellum. This is the prefrontal cortex, and here it's red because its connectivity with the amygdala is positive. And here you see 0. On the y-axis is functional connectivity, and down here are the age levels. So in these young children, we're seeing positive connectivity between these structures, and in older children, negative connectivity, where you can do that turning off and modulating of the amygdala with the prefrontal cortex. And then at age 18 to 22, at later adolescence, we see even more negative connectivity. So really over time, we're going from a positive connectivity to a negative connectivity, and that's a typical developmental pattern. It's some really nice work from Dylan Gee. And so what we've come to understand is that the neural signature of pediatric anxiety is well characterized by dysfunction of this emotion regulation circuit, also called a corticoamygdalar circuit. So the amygdala medial prefrontal cortex emotion regulation circuit looks like this. Here's a cartoon. We have connectivity from the amygdala to the prefrontal cortex. Typically, we have a negative correlation here, an anti-correlation, and from that we infer that when one turns on, the other turns off, but we're still inferring connectivity. And this is what happens in pediatric anxiety disorder. We see continued positive correlation or connectivity between these structures. So when those kids, typical kids, are getting older and they're developing a negative connectivity, or we see negative correlation between these structures in older children, in children with pediatric anxiety disorder, we are not seeing that pattern. So greater connectivity in anxiety is greater connectivity between these structures is characterizing anxiety disorder. And you can use that to spin out and think about some of the different kinds of anxiety disorders I spoke of earlier. Here's a kid who's looking kind of worried, holding a book. We could imagine this child is worrying about their test and feeling anxious. And maybe they aren't able to, they're seeing the test as very threatening, and the prefrontal cortex isn't able to say, you did well on the practice exam last night, you studied it with your tutor, you studied it with your mom, you're going to take this test, and actually, if you don't do well on this test, it's really not the end of the world anyway. So they're feeling somewhat anxious. Here's the one who's having trouble separating. Maybe they're not able to do that cognitive reappraisal. My mom's going to come back and pick me up. Nothing terrible is going to happen to her while she's not here. Or the fear of the spider, not able to say, oh, that's just a rubber one, it's a Halloween party. Not able to really make these modulatory decisions. So to wrap up, the neural signature of pediatric anxiety, really, I've taught you 3 basic characteristics. They have children with anxiety disorder have enlarged amygdala. The amygdala tend to overactivate in response to fear or surprise, and that this connectivity with the prefrontal cortex that allows modulation of threat is not developing typically, and they tend to have positive connectivity between these areas when you want to have a more modulatory control. So I'm going to shift into a little bit about the reading brain. I'm not really going to talk about the reading brain circuit today because it's not where we focused our research, but I feel like if I'm coming up here and talking to you about the neuroscience of anxiety and reading, got to mention this. So using all the tools I've taught you, structure, function, and resting state, scientists over the last 2 decades have really well mapped the neural signature of dyslexia and the reading brain. This is not as cartoon-like as some people show, so I'm going to explain it to you. This is, again, the left lateral surface of the brain. This is the front of the brain, the back of the brain. This is the occipital lobe, the temporal lobe, the frontal lobe, parietal lobe up here. And generally, when you look at a cartoon of reading and dyslexia, you'll see 3 circles, one here in the front, one in the frontal cortex, one here in the temporoparietal, and one here in occipitotemporal. And what we have come to understand from having individuals go in a scanner and do reading and reading-related tasks, both adults and children who are good readers, is that the better reader they are, the more they're activating these regions. And we've also come to understand that individuals with reading problems don't show this normal reading circuitry. Indeed, they show underactivation of these 2 posterior areas, the temporoparietal and the occipitotemporal, and often overactivation of the frontal cortex on the right hemisphere. And that's come to be understood as the neural signature of dyslexia. It's many, many papers have been written about this. It's been a huge focus, a very important focus of research for a long time. So why does reading matter? I'm going to shift now into really the third part of the talk and think about reading and anxiety and how they matter and go together. Roughly 5 million children have a learning disorder. 80% of them have a reading disorder. I want to take a pause and talk about terminology. When I say reading disorder, people often say dyslexia, they often say reading disorder, they might say language-based learning disability, specific learning disability with impairment in reading, or specific learning disorder in reading. Some of those terms come from DSM-5, some come from schools and how you classify kids. Essentially, when I'm talking about reading disorder or RD, I'm talking about children who are having trouble with reading relative to the rest of their development. And this could be characterized by, reading is multifaceted, right? You can have trouble decoding words, you can have trouble with reading fluency, you can have trouble with reading comprehension. So all of these things could compose a reading disorder. It's a highly heritable problem. The prevalence is estimated between 5 and 17%. That means in a typical classroom, 2 or 3 kids may have a reading problem. So for the rest of these, so most children are going to learn to read easily and go on to graduate. But for children who have a hard time learning to read in first grade, they have a 75% chance of being poor readers in high school. And this puts them on a trajectory for increased risk. So these children are going to go on and graduate fine, and these children are at increased risk for all kinds of things like school failure, physical health problems, alcoholism, depression, and anxiety. But in addition to leading to all of these things, sometimes reading problems co-occur with anxiety. And that's what we're really interested in focusing on today. So this co-occurrence of anxiety and dyslexia or reading problems is not unfamiliar to us in the room, right? We've all seen how these things can interact with each other. It's well recognized by parents and teachers, has not been well studied, and some of the front runners in this arena are here and going to speak with you today. I'm going to show you some of the early work. We knew that there was a negative influence of anxiety on achievement, and also later that there could be a negative influence of reading problems on anxiety. So you can see that both directions can be happening. We have some early studies showing that children with reading disorder are at increased risk for anxiety symptoms, and a more recent 2013 epidemiologic study showing high rates of co-occurring reading and anxiety disorders in children. So this isn't a trivial problem, and it's something we really need to pay attention to. We haven't paid enough attention to it. That's why talks like today are so important. And 2 of the panelists today have been really instrumental in helping develop this model and this idea that there's a bidirectional relationship between the co-occurrence of reading and anxiety symptoms. So I've only shown this in one direction here. You could have reading problems which can spiral into anxiety about reading, and then in turn affect reading. And you could also flip this on its head and say you have anxiety, which makes it hard to learn to read, which in turn is going to contribute to having even more anxiety. And in fact, there are some findings supporting both directions. Increased anxiety symptoms predict later achievement problems. And from one of our speakers, or to both of our speakers, deficits in oral reading fluency predict later anxiety symptoms. So given this behavioral pattern, in my lab, we were really curious about the brain basis of anxiety in reading disorders. So we set out to study this. And prior studies, most imaging studies of reading and reading problems have focused on that reading network. They've put individuals in a scanner and looked at brain activation during reading and reading-related tasks, and looked at the reading circuit and its functional connectivity. But we were interested in anxiety. So we wanted to study the brain basis of anxiety and reading disorder. And so we decided to look for the neural signature of anxiety in children with reading disorder. And this is the cover of the journal where we published this paper. And you can see in this picture this child looking up at us, somewhat concerned about the letters in front of her, all a jumble, and this, I'm going to explain this study to you, how we really were able to link reading impairment, anxiety, and what was happening in the brain. We asked, could a common biological mechanism underlie the co-occurrence of anxiety and reading problems? And we wondered if it might be this emotion regulation circuitry that could be the culprit, in part because this amygdala prefrontal connectivity was already known to be altered in association with self-reported math anxiety. So we thought this was a good place to start looking. So I'll tell you a bit about the study. We recruited participants for an imaging study. We recruited them from general and special ed schools in and around New York. Children were 7 to 12 years old. In the end, we had 22 typically developing children and 21 children with reading disorder. They came and they did an MRI scan and they did a lot of testing. So I can tell you how we characterized them. Our criteria for a reading disorder included the child had to have suspected reading problems, a history of difficulty learning, or previously diagnosed reading disorder. So we really built a strong network, in part through my years of clinical experience, with educators at schools, learning specialists in the schools. And it was okay if a child hadn't had a full neuropsych, but they had to have had someone really worrying about their reading. And then they had to have poor performance on the day they came to us and did our neuropsych battery on 3 out of 5 of our measures of reading, which included pseudo-word reading, encoding, which is spelling, rapid naming, word reading accuracy, and silent or oral reading comprehension. And they could not participate in our study if they had any other disorder, and that's really a critical distinction here. So we did not include children who met criteria for an anxiety disorder, or depression, or autism spectrum disorder, or ADHD, or developmental coordination disorder, or Tourette's, or tic disorder, nothing else in our study. So it took a while to recruit this sample. We allowed in children who had writing or math disorder, because you're pretty hard-pressed to find a kid with a reading disorder who doesn't have some issue with writing and math, and we also didn't think that that would conflate our study. So then we took all this data and we made a reading impairment score. So we didn't want to just say, oh, this child had a reading problem and look at their word reading. We really wanted to capture a holistic view of their reading difficulties. So they got 1 point for each of the following. Remember I said, in order to count as a reading disorder kid in our study, they had to have problems performing 3 out of 5. But they could have had 4 or 5 instead of 3. So we gave them 1 point for each reading measure where they scored at or below the 25th percentile. We gave them a point for having a history of academic difficulty by teacher report. We gave them a point for having a history of received reading intervention, and a prior diagnosis of reading disorder warranted another point. And last, if they had placement in a special education school. Okay, so that's how we measured reading impairment. And so here you know that higher scores mean more problems. We also measured anxiety using the Revised Children's Manifest Anxiety Scale, which is a self-report of anxiety symptoms. So rather than having parents rate their children, which is often what you see like on a CBCL, a child behavior checklist, instead, or sometimes a Connors, instead we had the child rate their own symptoms of anxiety, and they answered questions like, I get nervous when I do things, well, I get nervous when things do not go the right way for me. I'm afraid of a lot of things. I feel someone will tell me I do things the wrong way. I worry when I go to bed at night. So that's what we looked at. And now I'm going to show you some of our data. First, we looked at whether anxiety and reading went together in our sample, as it's been shown in other samples. And so here on the x-axis, I'll show you children with reading disorders versus typically developing kids. It says healthy there. And on the y-axis, their anxiety score. So here you can see there's a significant difference. The children with reading disorder had many more symptoms on the RC-MAS than the typically developing children. Here, I'm going to show you anxiety score versus reading impairment score. And so you can see a nice linear relationship. As anxiety gets higher, reading impairment is getting higher. And then last, I'm going to show you some results that are replicating some of the work of Amy Grills and Sharon Vaughn, where we have anxiety on the x-axis and reading fluency on the y-axis. So this is someone's ability to read fluently, ease of access, et cetera. And here you see, again, a linear relationship going the other direction, because now here, remember, reading impairment, high scores are bad. So more anxiety, more reading impairment. Here, reading fluency, high scores are good, and low scores are bad. So more anxiety, worse reading fluency, consistent with what other researchers have shown. So then the next thing we wanted to do is take a look in the brain. And we looked again, I'm going to remind you of the neural signature of pediatric anxiety. Remember, we have this connectivity from the amygdala to the medial prefrontal cortex. It's typically negative. And in children with anxiety disorder, it's positive. And we mapped connectivity from the amygdala. Here's the amygdala on the left and the right side of the brain. This is an axial view. This is if you slice my head this way, parallel to the floor. This is the front of the brain. This is the back of the brain. And here's the medial prefrontal cortex. And we saw significant group differences between the children with reading disorder who did not have anxiety disorder and the typically developing kids in the connectivity of this circuit from the amygdala to the medial prefrontal cortex. And this is a bar graph to show you here's 0. Here are the children with reading disorder. Here are the children who are typically developing, and as expected, they have negative connectivity between these structures, and the reading disorder children have positive connectivity between these structures, exactly consistent with a pediatric anxiety disorder. So next, we wanted to look at the brain-behavior relationships. And so on the x-axis here, I'm going to show you the functional connectivity. Each child's connectivity score between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, and on the y-axis their anxiety, and you see a nice linear relationship. The higher the connectivity, the more anxiety the person has. Remember, positive connectivity is indicative of pediatric anxiety disorder, and so this is exactly what we saw, greater functional connectivity between the, this stands for central medial amygdala and the medial prefrontal cortex, and anxiety. And we looked at the same kind of relationship between functional connectivity and reading. So this was, I guess, not surprising because of the group differences, but very important to me as someone who's worked a lot with children learning to read. A linear relationship here, very strong, between the functional connectivity in the anxiety circuit and reading scores. So it wasn't so surprising that the anxiety circuit would predict anxiety. Lots of people have shown that. What we showed that was new was that this anxiety predicted reading. This brain signature of anxiety predicted reading. We already had the behavioral finding, right? We knew how much the kid rated their own anxiety, predicted their reading. Now we had how much their brain said it looked anxiety, predicted their reading. And the last thing we did was this fancy mathematical modeling to try to understand if anxiety symptoms were on a causal pathway from this brain difficulty to reading problems. So we knew that anxiety was associated with reading impairment. I showed you that first. Then I showed you that this amygdala medial prefrontal cortex circuit was predicting reading impairment, and it's predicting anxiety as expected. And we did some math to show that this is really on a causal pathway. And it's really important, because what we're able to say here then is that this anxiety is very important to the outcome here of reading impairment. So to wrap up, if connectivity from the amygdala is associated with anxiety and reading problems in children with reading disorder, then if we could reduce reading-related anxiety, reading might improve. And this is really giving us a brain basis for this hypothesis that, fortunately for us all, there are people here who are going to speak to us today about how to try to improve this and how to try to work on anxiety for children with reading disorders. So here's a nice future goal, hashtag goals, right? And the other thing that we concluded in this paper was that another possibility was that we weren't adequately measuring the anxiety symptoms in children with reading disorder. So maybe we screened out all these kids who had anxiety, but we didn't screen out the kids in my sample who had high levels of anxiety, maybe because we're not asking the right questions. And really, I think we need a new tool. Our tools for understanding anxiety and even our categories of anxiety disorder in the DSM do not include something like reading-related anxiety, which would ask questions like, I get nervous when asked to read out loud. I worry about reading subtitles in a movie or on TV. I worry about being called on in class. I get nervous, I'll have trouble doing my homework by myself. So we really need a scale, which fortunately people are working on, that will allow us to characterize the kind of anxiety people feel when they have reading problems. So last I'll conclude with, did we meet the objectives? First, I'm hoping that you can explain that MRI takes pictures of the brain that will show us the size or shape of a brain structure, that how a structure activates during a task and is interconnected with other structures, forming circuits that serve cognition and behavior. Second, I'm hoping you understand that emotion regulation requires cognitive appraisal of emotional stimuli. And when this is not working well, anxiety can arise, and this amygdala medial prefrontal circuit serves this function. And last, that children with reading disorder, but not anxiety disorder, at least as we define it now, show a pattern of aberrant emotion regulation circuitry that associates with their anxiety level and their reading skill and is on a causal pathway from brain difference to skill deficit. So thank you for your time. I'm going to wrap up and have some questions. Thanks.
So if anybody has questions.
Hello.
Hi.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
So what's to prevent a student who hasn't been identified with anxiety or the reading disorder from being classified in a emotional disturbed category, I guess? So what I'm seeing is that some students are being classified as emotionally disturbed because they have a lot of anxiety, but the reading deficit is not in there anywhere. So have you seen what's a parent or a school administrator to do? How do they know what to look for?
So I'm going to try to rephrase your question, see if I have it right, is what should we do, or should we be on high alert for reading problems when we see a child with anxiety problems? Okay. So I run a clinic where we test lots of children, and hopefully all the many postdoctoral fellows I've trained in the last 20 years are asking exactly that question now. I think that we are not so well educated to understand this, and I'm always kind of metaphorically banging my fist on the table when we get new trainees and saying, you know, there's a reason that people have anxiety sometimes. And it's not always true, but it's really important to think about these subtle learning problems that may not have been detected yet that could be contributing to some of the emotional difficulties a child is now showing in school. We 100% need to be on alert for that. And I'm not sure, I think I take it you all are the very important people who are going to bring this information out into the world and make sure people understand to look for that. And I, on my side, as I'm training psychologists, can try and get them to think about that too.
A very simple question. I understand the connection, the positive connection between anxiety and reading. So I work with parents in a school, and they're all kids that are typical, so to speak. Could you treat the anxiety? I'm always looking for a medical intervention because it's a starting point, not that they really want that, but could you treat the anxiety and then find an increase in the ability to gain skill in all of your areas of reading?
I think so, absolutely. I think we're going to hear a lot about that today. People are working actively to do that and also to make things accessible for teachers and administrators and typical in all school settings. One more question, or? Okay, last question.
So I understand that increased amygdala size can cause anxiety, and that we can see the connection between the reading, but does it work in the opposite? If I do intervention, is that going to change the amygdala size? And if I increase SEL work into my reading intervention, that would be the ideal response to a reading anxiety diagnosis, which might come in the next DSM?
I didn't hear the very last word you just said.
The DSM. So like if that came in the next DSM, would we imagine that it would be a combination of reading intervention with SEL work or social emotional learning?
Okay, I'm parsing your question. You had really two parts to your question. One is, if we treat anxiety, does the amygdala change? And so we do know that with some kinds of intervention that we do see plasticity and brain change. The other part of your question is, if we could get learning-related anxiety or something like that into DSM, which is, you know, I'm working on another project where we're trying to get something into the DSM. It's like a 10-year endeavor. If we could do that, would that help? I mean, I think the DSM is for classifying and for diagnosing. I think your question was really more about if we can put social emotional learning into school systems, will that help children with their learning? I'm not 100% sure what you mean by SEL. I think that if we could do very well-described, evidence-based intervention for anxiety, we can help children with their learning.
Now, the first question, sorry, was actually reading intervention and size of amygdala. So we know that,
Oh,
like, is reading intervention, we know if
that would be a cool study, and then we should scan them too, so we can answer. But we have to write an R01 to do that. An R01, by the way, is like a $2.5 million grant from the NIH, so we can study things. All right, thank you for your time and attention. It was fantastic.